So basically, in my experience, it produces demonic livestock and nothing but ill fate and witch's brew is kind of where I'm coming
Yeah.
from.
Okay, so that's a
We're
very
still talking
subjective
about
take.
lambs here, right?
We're talking about the silencing of the lambs, I believe, from the way Matt described it.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty metal. Pretty metal. Okay.
Something like that. Black Phillip? Do you have a Black Phillip? Is that what you're saying?
What's Black Phillip?
Oh my
wow.
God, you don't know Black Phillip?
I don't. Should I know Black Phillip?
Even I know Black Phillip.
Okay, well that's
So you've seen that
actually,
movie.
yeah, I guess that's saying a lot.
I have,
That's
yes.
the one movie Andy's seen. One out of at least a few hundred.
Wasn't
At
my
least.
choice either, but I now know Black Phillip.
Wait, do I have to look this up?
It's from the movie The Witch.
Yeah,
Okay.
Matt, that is your homework is to watch.
Look it up. We don't have to look it up now. You should watch the movie. It's not bad.
Yeah, just it should be on your list.
It's
Okay, so it's the
it's
goat.
fun.
Yeah.
All right.
So, anyways, that sheep was probably raised by biodynamic lambing. Welcome back. We're the Poor Pearls Almanac. We're talking about biodynamics and
Hell yeah.
the moon, I guess.
Or hell no.
Demonic sheep, lambs, goats, whatever you got.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. Follow the moon.
Basically, it's limited to small ruminants, though. That really is the case.
And crystals.
Cloven,
Can't forget the crystals.
cloven-hooved demons. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, we're going to talk about biodynamics today. To do that, we have to talk about its founder, a fellow named Rudolf Steiner. The man Steiner is known for many things. He was instrumental in a lot of educational content, especially for kids, through the Waldorf schools, as well as agriculture through biodynamics. In his words, in quote, how to know higher worlds, which, that's just one of those things you hear and it's only going to go in a good direction.
Hey, give me an hour and a tab of acid and I'll show you an higher world.
Yeah. He was interested in this concept called anthroposophy. I'm never going to pronounce this correctly. I'm sorry, everyone. Anthroposophy, what he considered spiritual science. And this has kind of been this thing that's occupied space in like a lot of the like quote unquote natural, agricultural, naturalist, like homeopathic, yada, yada, yada spaces. And it spans, across the globe. A lot of the agricultural movements around biodynamics, there's at least 6,000 farms today that fall under this like umbrella of biodynamics. And like I said, Steiner created this concept of the Waldorf school, and there's over 2,000 of those today. And I think that speaks to like the fact that we do have to talk about this dude because he has kind of transcended his place and time in Germany.
I mean, never a good start to go back to the Germans.
Yeah, usually not, no. Now, Steiner does get a bad rap for some very valid reasons, but as we'll see, it's a little bit more complicated than a good-bad perspective.
Yeah, but didn't the Nazis sort of buy into the biodynamics?
I mean, sort of.
Sort of Nazi? Yeah, that's usually not an issue. Sort of.
Yeah, yeah. So, we'll get there. But first, we got to talk about Steiner's like foundation here. So he was really big into this concept of like cosmic energy.
So basically, someone asking for your moon rising, which is usually harmless.
Yeah. He argued that seeds, for example, when they were planted, didn't just like germinate, they dissolved, and the plant itself is created by the forces of the entire surrounding universe.
I feel like you can just sprout a seed.
Yeah, yeah. So, like, obviously, from a literal standpoint, this is wrong, but from like a metaphorical position, it does highlight how we understand the role of like microbes and fungi and bacteria in the germination of seeds into plants, right?
Okay, so it sounds like he's trying to, what's the word? I had something, hang on.
Write the Bible, his own Bible.
Is that what we're going to talk about?
The Bible? We actually, yeah, for a little bit.
I was going to say...
You're about to learn so much dirt about Jesus. You'll appreciate that joke in like 10 minutes. All right, so from one perspective, he was a visionary theorist that was like wildly ahead of his time in like one way. From another, Steiner was a, let's say, self-proclaimed clairvoyant and supporter of weird medicine that highlights some of the more dangerous strains of what exists in like the organic, biodynamic, and anti-scientific wing of the holistic movement. And that's despite Steiner's own support of bridging modern science and his, let's call it, occultism. Yeah, I know. The second someone says occult, you're just like, huh, interesting.
So I wasn't sure if this episode was about witches or goats from the beginning, and now I'm still not sure.
It's both. So, for example, Steiner believed that mistletoe was a cancer treatment because it was a parasite that killed its host plants. Why wouldn't that make sense? He also believed that plants' medicinal potential was influenced by the position of the sun and the moon and the planets, and therefore is important to harvest the plant at the right time.
Oh man, the poop horns are coming.
But what?
We're getting there.
I think we talk about poop too much.
You mean we talk poo much, Elliot?
No, see, I do this for free. See, I don't have to be here, and that makes one of us an idiot.
Okay, so let's back up. If we contextualize his work, we can better understand kind of how biodynamics evolved into what it is today. Now, while Steiner is described as a socialist by many of his supporters today and a quasi-fascist by his opponents, he was self-described as what he called an, in quote, individual anarchist who believed that no system would hold good for all time, which would likely categorize him as like a modern libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, syndicalist today, which I think helps contextualize some of his beliefs. Steiner attempted to tie spirituality to science, and we see this become more obvious as the New Age movement begins in the 1970s.
Okay, so this guy's trying to explain spirituality through science.
Yeah, well, he's trying to use spirituality to define science. And what we'll see is he has this idea that we can't rely on like science and improvements through technology without integrating spirituality into it. That technology and modern science isn't bad, but it should be to improve our old ways, not to create entirely new ways.
That doesn't sound insane.
Yeah, it sounds interesting.
He's putting God in the machine. Put it in there.
Yeah, basically. I mean, I think he would be really an Elon Musk,
Oh.
but because Elon Musk is destroying technology,
Oh.
not because Elon Musk is good at technology, for all the wrong reasons. Like he would fuck with Teddy K. Anyways, so Steiner really, the reason why we know his name, it starts with him creating this thing called the Anthroposophical Society. And I'm probably saying that wrong, and I'm sorry because it's a stupid name.
I'll come to your defense here, Andy. Yeah, it's not a good name.
Yeah.
And it's not a good name for if you're basing a whole
Yeah. So he founded this in December of 1912, which is where he starts to put his ideas into practice, including the first Waldorf school in a city named Stuttgart, which is just a fucking Germanish shit name.
Stuttgart, Andy. It's
Stuttgart.
Stuttgart. Yeah, you got it.
How did I get that wrong? So he created the school in 1919, and the point was to give education to the children of employees at a cigarette factory. At the same time, he was founding this thing called The Coming Day, which was a network of cooperative businesses. All right, this sounds like good stuff, right? Now, the fundamental idea behind belonging to the society involved very high levels of commitment, which meant like members were supposed to really only socialize or mostly socialize and buy and sell goods primarily with one another, with the idea that it conserves resources and cycles of sources through the movement, right? If we're all in the same crew and I'm buying your bread and you're buying my cheese or whatever, like all the money's staying in the loop, right? The idea was that this allows the organization to grow.
So it's like a weird culty co-op-y pact. Like we own everything together kind of thing.
We're all in this together by force. Yes.
Of course.
Now, Steiner, part of his spirituality, we'll call it, had this idea of like an esoteric Christology. And his understanding of Christ is that when he died, in his words, and quote, the substance of Jesus Christ entered each of us,
It did.
and that the earth is Christ's body. While this seems unrelated to the reason we're even recording this, it's not. The whole idea here is that working with the soil is to connect with Jesus Christ himself, and that spirituality tied with working with the land and nature wasn't like this like dangerous pagan thing. It was actually Christian values that were misunderstood by everyone else, and he has figured this shit out.
So pretty culty shit. It's
Yeah,
serving cult.
it's cult adjacent at the very least. The actual birth of biodynamics isn't from like this, we'll call it project, society, whatever. It actually came from a series of specific lectures by Steiner in 1924. These lectures were only given a year before his death, and it didn't, because I don't think he really expected to die that soon, and like this was something he did later in his life, obviously. He didn't leave much like clarification or writing to like understand how to actually do this shit. And as we're gonna see, when he explains stuff, he doesn't just like say, hey, go get a bucket of hay, add yada yada yada. No, that's too fucking simple. Doesn't happen here. So what this means is that like trying to apply biodynamics is very subjective, and it leaves a lot of interpretation. Now, in 1927, 3 years after this lecture or the series of lectures, farmers began to do what they called biological dynamic agriculture, which obviously then later was shortened to biodynamics. The development of his own interest in agriculture was really based in like healthy foods, which is a common theme we see with a lot of the biodynamics movement. We talked about John Hershey 6 episodes ago, and he was a big biodynamics guy, right? And he was all about like the quality of the food, the health of the soil, the health of the food makes you a healthier person. That comes from Steiner. What happened was basically Steiner had these students that were in the animal sciences, veterinary sciences, and they were saying like animals are getting sicker, the crop quality is getting poorer, there's more diseases in the field, we don't know what the hell is happening. Steiner, you're a brilliant person that's a once in a lifetime voice. Tell us how to fix this. And he was like, okay, sure. So then like he went out in a field in 1923, right before a series of lectures, and was like, you know what I need to do? I'm going to fill up some cow horns with manure, bury those in the soil in the fall, dig them up in the spring, dilute those in a pail of water that's mixed with an energetic stirring technique. And that's going to fix your soil. Now, today that's called 500 in the biodynamic movement.
Finally, we got to the poop horn part of the episode.
Yeah.
I don't understand any of what you just said.
I don't
He
I don't
put poop
either.
in horns and buried it,
Yeah, and then dug it back up. And then put it in a bucket.
and that's called 500.
And then mixed it with water and then sprayed it on the dirt again.
Mm-hmm.
Science. Science.
And that's called 500.
Yeah,
That's called 500.
why 500?
I don't it goes from 500 to 508. I couldn't tell you why.
Okay.
It's a nice round number.
All right, you guys ready for the logic here? Yeah, it's like the Fiat 500. It's all the same thing. Never ask Fiat where it got the 500 number from.
Wait,
Anyways, what?
where did they get the 500 from? Do you know?
No, I
Oh,
don't.
all right.
It was a biodynamics joke.
All right.
Come on, Matt. All right, so the logic behind this was basically that, and this is going to seem so obvious to all of you, that since manure had been inside a living organism, it was filled with what he considered astral and ethereal energy, astral being nitrogen carrying and ethereal being oxygen carrying, and that these would be intensified by placing it within a horn, which would, in his words, and quote, send the currents inward with more than usual intensity, end quote. The stirring itself would transfer the energy to the water, and it would help establish a quote unquote personal relationship to the matter, end quote.
Yep, I don't have any questions here. Sounds like standard run-of-the-mill magic. He was a wizard. Steiner was a wizard.
Mhm. I wonder where you, if you're just like starting out, a horn is a pretty hard ingredient for this potion.
Yeah, I there must be like a black market for horns, I guess.
Yeah, I guess.
Pretty sure he just found it when he was walking out on the farm.
He was like, yep, this.
Yeah, that's
Like
what it sounds
pops it
like to
off
me.
one of his cows.
In terms of like Steiner's general beliefs, he was kind of an outliner in saying that like soil health is a huge issue, and that the solutions were not these like atomized changes like machinery in a factory, but like a comprehensive complex system that needed to be kept in balance. Like he figured that part out pretty good. Like kudos to that. Now, where he gets a little tricky and we end up seeing a big issue later on in the biodynamics movement is that like he has this like astral, ethereal, yada 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 thing, but then he makes the argument that humans represent an evolutionary advance beyond the astral level. And this is going to become a huge problem when like environmentalism and deep ecology rise up 50 years later.
Yeah, nothing can be misconstrued from that reasoning.
I know, right? Like, what could go wrong from saying everything that applies to the rest of the life on the earth doesn't apply to humans?
Wait, that's not true.
Yeah, exactly. To my point about our new universal application of 500, he had a bunch of other preparations, and I want to just kind of quickly cover them. I'm not going to go in that much detail. He had one that was called 502, and what this is you take yarrow, the plant, and you put it in the bladder of a stag. You expose it to sunlight all summer, then you bury it for the winter. He had another one that included putting chamomile flowers in intestines, oak bark, valerian, and a bunch of other plant stuff that were shoved into animal stuff. And the idea is that you've got these two cosmic forces from the plants and the animals, and we're smashing them together. He recommended burning weed seeds in order to inhibit moon forces that accelerated weed growth. Yeah. Unsurprisingly, a number of criticisms were like leveled at Steiner for his kind of off the walls thoughts, right? And like I said, he wasn't really interested in this idea of going back to the past, but finding ways to do the past better, I guess, right? Like, let's not use fertilizers and all this other stuff. Let's just find a better way to do what we've always done.
I can see how he was in line with a lot of like the permanent ag movement, but definitely like his own kind of freaky brand of it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, let's take a quick break. We're going to dive into it, progressing past the Second World War and what that looks like.
Are you finding that there's too much fash in fast fashion? This is Carla with Lenin's Linens. We apply the immortal linenist science to keep clothes lasting for decades. But you don't have to take my word for it. You can check out our pop-up shop in the Red Square in Moscow, Russia, and see how long our work holds up with our hand-picked Short King model, the one and only 100-year-old Vladimir Lenin. Wow, look at that drip. So stop Stalin and get your Lenin's Linens today. Exclusions apply. See Vladimir Putin for details.
By 1940, the concept of biodynamic farming had stretched across 4 continents, and this was because of a handful of very dedicated followers to his lectures. Of the 111 attendees that went to his lecture when he initially did it, 60 of them came together and created the Agricultural Experimental Circle. And the idea was basically to experiment based on Steiner's framework. And like I said, he didn't give a whole lot of explanation of how to farm this way. He's just like, hey, here's some tools you can use. I'm not going to explain with any actual science how they work. I'm going to tell you that a farm should be fully sustainable by itself with no inputs. Figure it the fuck out. So this organization was like, we're going to make this knowledge more publicly available. We're going to change the world. Part of it was older farmers who were like, had some money and wanted to fuck off and try to figure it out. And then part of it is like doe-eyed college kids that are just like, I'm going to save the world from hunger. And their job, according to Steiner, were to, in his words, disprove materialism with its own weapons. So he was like, go learn their ways and then find how our solutions fix their problems. One of the people that was one of these young doe-eyed folks was a man named Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. And he would become a really important voice for biodynamics from like the 30s through the 60s and 70s.
And is this mostly in Europe?
It is. While there's this explosion of biodynamics across the globe in response to like petrochemical fertilizers and an increasing skepticism about modern conventional science, there was a lot of like concern about the unintended consequences of new technologies, like very justifiable seeing how most of them turned out, like DDT. The problem was that their concerns weren't framed within like the scope that conventional science didn't have all the answers quite yet, but rather that the causes of the problems were like not scientific. They were because you weren't including spirituality in it.
So the problem wasn't the chemicals being dumped into the soil, it was about the bad vibes.
Bad vibes only.
Yeah, that's about it. All of our problems are just bad vibes.
So nothing with the Nazis creeping up, huh? I figured there was something in there.
My friend,
Especially with the
there
name
always
Einfried Pfeiffer.
Oh, Einfried. The fife. Yeah, we're going to talk about the fife. Like I said, Steiner was notoriously impossible to like tie down to like a very specific point, right? He's got these like really spacey, difficult to pin down, ambiguous language to like describe everything. But that also means like you can translate whatever he says into what you want. The Nazis didn't really like him for a couple of reasons. They even made an attempt on his life, but certain parts of the Nazi party really liked him. So like the Green Wing was into his like concern about soil health, and like this idea of like the closed loop farm goes really well with nationalism, right? That like let's have a closed loop country, which means closed loop farms, right? That meant they could be as racially pure as possible because all their food is grown in the racially pure Aryan yada yada yada. And also, probably not important, but I'll mention it anyway. The International Board for the Anthroposophical Society wrote a letter to Hitler saying that Steiner didn't have relationships with Jewish circles and that Steiner was of pure Aryan heritage, which probably nothing there. Probably nothing to think about that part. So after Steiner's death, the leadership for the Anthroposophic Society basically leaned into the Nazis thing. Like they basically removed anyone that was ethnically Jewish or non-German or anti-fascist. And it was just a bunch of fascist adjacent people who were like, yeah, we're not Nazis, but we're really damn close. While the more occult part of it, the weird shit wasn't really trusted, what they really cared about was like the soil health and like this like purity concept that they found valuable, and has kind of, this whole thing is kind of like haunted the biodynamics movement for like very valid reasons to this day.
So they wanted to benefit from aligning with the Nazi party, but not enough that they could be held accountable for aligning with the Nazi party. They sort of did the shimmy, the Kansas City shuffle.
Trump on January 6th.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like
Call it whatever you want.
it's like the Nazi version of I'm not touching you. It's like I'm not really a fascist.
Technically, no. You cannot prove that I've specifically, yeah, that.
No Jews though.
Yeah, that.
So it was a country club.
Yeah.
Sort of. You could say that.
Yeah.
So we mentioned Pfeiffer, that he doesn't help this whole scenario, right? So a lot of his writing relies on this trope of the peasant farmer and the loss of quote unquote traditional culture. And we all know what that means. In 1938, he wrote that it was up to Europe to create a new culture that could, in quote, perceive life and growth as an organic whole over the entire earth, which just got real bad Nazi vibes, right? Now, in Pfeiffer's book, he doesn't do the Steiner thing. He actually tries to give like practical application of biodynamics. He dedicated a chapter to global farming practices, and he highlights a lot of sustainable agriculture, like what we saw in China when F.H. King wrote about it, and even wrote about like the permanent agriculture advocates in the United States and all the stuff that they were doing.
So he rebranded a little bit.
Yeah.
Is this an attempt to pivot?
His Operation Paperclip. So Pfeiffer's book made biodynamics more accessible to like people that weren't necessarily into the more esoteric, hippy dippy kind of shit. And there's a lot of people that end up kind of tapping into this like vision, right? So you've got folks like this dude who's a writer in England named Viscount Lymington, which is just the most fucking British name. I could not even come up with a more British name than that.
Well,
Isn't Viscount like
yeah, Viscount's probably his title.
yeah.
Is
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Okay, even better. All right, so this Viscount dude, he wrote
That is funny.
he wrote this dude Viscount Lymington wrote this book.
I'm gonna name my son Viscount.
He wrote this book called Famine in England, which is going to be really great for your British fucking child, Matt. And the whole point of the book is that like the way we address all of the issues going on in pre-World War II is self-determination. We're going to stop the communist takeover, and this is his words, not mine, yellow race war or a jihad. And they were going to remove the immigrants that he considered, in his words again, the scum of subhuman population.
Yep, that's Viscount, all right.
Vicky.
That sounds like the 1930s aristocracy.
Yeah.
Or honestly, like the 2020s aristocracy.
It honestly is so shocking the English didn't just like team up with the Nazis. Like,
Mhm.
I mean,
really
they had a
is.
chance to.
They thought
They-
about it.
They could have taken a cut.
They just didn't want a different king. They wanted to keep the same king.
Yeah, there would have been a fight after that.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right, so let's switch to the U.S. because, like, fuck Europe.
And I've always said that.
We're so
You're
back.
living proof.
Yeah. All right. So the first person in the United States to use biodynamics was a dude named Henry Higgins, and he just did it in his backyard garden in Princeton, New Jersey. This is totally irrelevant. He doesn't do anything with it. Nothing happens because of it. I just found that fact and thought it was a cool one, so I included it. Not too far away from New Jersey, in a community named Spring Valley, New York, this thing called the Threefold Community was born. And basically, it was based on Steiner's idea of what he called the Threefold Commonwealth. This idea of a Threefold Commonwealth is basically like the libertarian version of, or alternative to, like big government. Part of this whole project was that they created a cooperative household, which was, in their words, and quote, a first step toward an association of producers and consumers, because, you know, that's what we need in our house, is to divide the people who live there between producers and consumers. So I should just start screaming at my kids as consumers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
After they capitalized their home, they created a vegetarian restaurant, and then they decided, well, we can't trust any of the produce, so we're gonna have to buy a farm, which they did fairly shortly after, 1926. Somehow this worked, and it helped the biodynamic movement spread. And what's interesting about the biodynamics movement is it has a very weird overlap across the political spectrum. So, like, in the early 20th century, socialists, Orthodox Christians, people with esoteric beliefs, anarchists, the Catholic Worker Movement, and the Catholic Rural Life Conference, they all made, like, agrarian settlement part of their vision or their programs. And a lot of it tied, like, naturalist ideology, capital N naturalist, that kind of like meshed with this like biodynamic perspective, some like quasi homeopathic kind of shit, before a lot of that was like formalized the way it is today.
This makes sense. You get a bunch of malleable people, like, you know, and you start them in the grassroots. They're dirt. They love dirt. They're talking about dirt. That's where
They can only afford dirt.
that's where your movement's going to start. The grassroots. These people are them. They are them.
It's a slippery slope, because soon they got the poop horns going, and you can't really pedal back from that.
Once you start packing in Aryan poop into the horns and making everything all nice and perfect, that's when you know you got something going.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no Aryan poop, because because humans were evolutionary separate from like the ethereal and so you couldn't use human stuff in cosmic
because you're above
farming shit, because you're above it. It doesn't have the same moon energy or some shit.
Wait,
So like literally cannot use the Aryan poop is what we're saying.
Something else.
they weren't closing the poop loop?
They were not closing the poop loop.
Oh my God, they had a one-way poop system. That's their downfall right there.
I mean, that automatically makes the farm not a closed loop. So
No wonder why it hasn't taken over yet. Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
All right. So into World War II and out of World War II, we got a big name pop up. J.I. Rodale, who everyone's probably heard of.
sure.
Okay, except for Elliot. So he's a big deal in the organic movement, founder of the Organic Farming and Gardening magazine in 1942. The big difference between the organic movement and the biodynamics movement really comes down to the spirituality. Most of the other shit is the same, like 95%. It's the spiritual shit that like fucks up biodynamics. While Rodale was more focused on the organic side, he built this whole vision of organic farming in Pennsylvania with the idea that like he's going to publish books and have an experimental farm, and like biodynamics is cool, but I think it's going to scare people off, even though he was also kind of off his rocker, as we're going to find out when we do organics. But he was kind of at the right place at the right time with the organic magazine, and like did really well publishing. The first issue that they released paired like organic practices with the biodynamic system and what they called the, in quote, indoor method, which was basically the British founder of organics, as we're going to talk about, Sir Albert Howard's work. And all of this like is, hey, biodynamics is cool. Let's talk about organics, though. And they tried to like grab everyone that was in this weird space to go down this one path. And our good buddy Pfeiffer was actually one of the main and regular contributors to the magazine. And I think points to like how much overlap there was with Rodale's organics and the biodynamics.
Yeah, because when I think of like Rodale, I think, I haven't heard any of the like celestial or astral stuff.
Not yet.
Also, for our listeners, the indoor method is INDORE, not
like in a house.
right.
There's no way I thought that was a planet in Star Wars.
Yeah, why would you?
That's the one they blew up, right?
You're asking the wrong person. The reason why I think Rodale is important to bring up is because of the power that he had in the organics movement. And then with some coincidence, a couple other major figures in biodynamics ended up nearby in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania became kind of the hub of both organics and biodynamics. And this is probably because of an 830-acre experimental farm that was owned by two folks named H. Alark Myron, which just sounds like you're shoving letters and said, yeah, that's a name, and then Mabel Pugh Myron.
Just a little 830-acre farm. Just a little thing.
Yeah, just a casual one. And their story is just beautiful. I hope you're ready for this. Mabel's family owned the Sun Oil Company, and her brothers were very publicly known as American fascists, which is, really good start to like getting into biodynamics. Mabel and her husband, a Swedish aristocrat, this dude, Alark Myron, also held extreme conservative values, and for undisclosed reasons, they were sent by their family to Argentina to manage a ranch. So, yeah. When they returned...
Is this post-World War II?
This is, during post-World War II, yes. When they came back, they're like, hey, we're into this anthroposophy thing. We're going to give money away to stuff. We're going to grow food biodynamically. Don't ask any questions.
Jesus Christ. What is it with libertarian farmers in Argentina? It's a Joel Southern reference for all you Philistines.
Nice. Their investments led to a number of other biodynamics farms in the region, some of which would develop things like training courses and tie into the Quakers of the region. And like, given Pennsylvania's like very religious and radical and occultist society historically, like it makes sense, right? You've got a bunch of hardcore Christians, the Amish, Quakers, and so on, that are cool with living like the past. So like it's an obvious like nice overlap, right? The courses, unlike Rodale's magazine, leaned much more heavily into that biodynamics, the occultism, but also were interested in like, how do you actually run a business or a farm? Like, how do you do bookkeeping? How do you understand like agricultural history? So why we got here, meteorology, and then like, again, some of that like culty shit where they're expected to like spend a lot of time with seasonal festivals, and like everyone was required to perform nativity plays every Christmas.
Now they're watching the homesteader like grifters on Instagram and thinking we're so back.
Yeah, they can just like sell shit everywhere on the internet now.
R.I.P. They would have loved the Instagram reels.
Yes. So we're gonna take a quick break. Gotta get into the much more modern history of biodynamics. Talk about why it's filled with fucking white supremacists. Ooh. I know you're excited.
I mean, grassroots, man, grassroots.
Hey, we're taking a quick break in the episode to remind you that you can get a whole lot more information from poorproles.com. On our website, we have access to our supplemental reader for the podcast, which provides more depth and context, as well as thorough citations for all of the stuff we talk about in the show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which updates you about limited releases, such as various nursery stock that we sometimes sell through the Poor Proles website, as well as updates about new merch that we have. You can also support the show through that website, poorproles.com, where you have access to our Patreon and our Substack to get early releases for articles and episodes. Now, if you enjoy the show and are just looking for even more audio content, go check out Tomorrow Today, which just wrapped up season 1, or tune into the Gastropocene, which is a project of myself and Dr. Aisha Khan to discuss the way our diets have driven the Anthropocene and what it looks like to use our diets for good. Now, back to the show. All right, so in the post-war years, a bunch of new issues spring up. You've got the baby boomers, right? Increased populations, questions about like whether or not it's sustainable to have as many people on the earth start coming up again like they were in the 20s and 30s. Our good friend Pfeiffer, who is the voice of this movement at the time, wrote that there just wasn't enough land to support the existing human population as it stood in 1949, which notoriously everyone starved the next year. He wrote, instead of asking ourselves whether there are too many people in the world, we're really forced to ask, are there not too many people massed in some spots and not enough in others? Be curious to know where he thought there were too many and where he thought there were too few. We don't know, but we can take some educated guesses. While Pfeiffer is obviously just one dude, there are a bunch of other people that wrote about like collapse and population control within the anthroposophic society. So like this was not like a outlier situation. This is in contrast to like the growing deep ecology movement that had sprung up in the 60s and the 70s alongside the environmental movement. And again, the reason I brought up the whole human thing earlier is that like biodynamics argues that there's like a qualitative difference between humans and everything else. And the environmental movement disagrees with that and saying that like humans are part of a greater system. And like the deep ecology movement is that humans aren't special. Like there's plenty of problems with deep ecology. I think we've talked about them in the past, but for our purposes right now, that's the important piece is that, like, what is the role of humans on the earth? And biodynamics said we are special, and science and deep ecology and environmentalism said, no, we're fucking not. As the environmental movement picked up more steam and like, it was like, oh, okay, this is going to stick around. People in biodynamics said we have to figure out a way to like tie together science and politics and spirituality to be relevant.
And when in doubt, latch yourself onto a grift-like spirituality.
Exactly. So as the rise of the Back to the Land movement sprung up in the late 60s with our good friends, the Nearings, and all the hippies that followed them out of the cities, biodynamics was kind of like this framework for a lot of the new age spirituality and like the naturalism kind of stuff of like people trying to get back in nature and like kind of like the Adam and Eve, like we exist in nature, not as part of it, but like as its keeper.
I mean, that's really what it's all about with the cult. It's all about timing. If you're really trying to start one, you know?
That's why Elliot started this podcast. He was like, I think the time is ripe for a weird cult.
True.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said. We were in the car.
And hey, we're doing it.
Living the dream. So this is where like biodynamics changes quite a bit in terms of like its followership. So like to this point, it's been like mostly like libertarian, anti-government people, anti-big government people, with like a hodgepodge of some socialists and anarchists and Christian radicals, but like largely like the agrarian right-winger dude who moonshines kind of shit. As this like urban exodus happens in the 60s and 70s, it's mostly, almost entirely like anarchists, socialists, and communists that are leaving the cities, going back to the land. And they're like, oh, this is cool. It makes me feel good. And they're like into the biodynamics thing. So like you've got this really quick shift in the dynamics of the politics behind the biodynamics movement. And like this fits into like the whole like getting into Buddhism and all that other shit that like white people did when they left the cities in the 60s and 70s.
Eastern
like
philosophy.
All of this kind of blends together. Yeah, the Eastern philosophy bullshit. Not that Eastern philosophy is bullshit, but like white dudes that like embrace it like overnight kind of stuff.
Yeah, take mushrooms once and then
they have all the answers. They had them before, but now they feel
somebody says namaste and it's a whole rabbit hole. I've seen it.
So yeah, it just like shifts significantly. It's not surprising then that like a lot of the new age like founders that like are big in the spiritual practices of the 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of these were directly influenced by Steiner, and they like found their way into like the anthroposophic society to like pull from both ends, like get the authority of like this ancient history and also like tie into like people wanted to do now. And a lot of this is tied to like Elliot just said, being at the right place at the right time. So you had this movement that had been slowly growing, and then you had like this very unique generation of baby boomers, right? The boomers are not like any other generation. Like we all know that. They took Steiner's belief of like this greater, cosmos, humans are special, but like we have this responsibility to take care of the land and yada yada. And then you've got these boomers that like internalized that into like selfness. The way boomers make everything about themselves, they made all of this about themselves, and that feeds into like that like hyper individual spirituality that is like the thing you think of when you think of like the hippies in the 60s and 70s. Now, one of the voices that really drove this specific brand of spirituality in the biodynamics movement is this dude named Alan Chadwick. And he basically is the key force in driving like biodynamics into the new age world, and was often characterized as like a very anti-science kind of guy. Many of Chadwick's students are leaders in the biodynamics movement today.
Goddamn boomers.
I mean, that's the least surprising thing in this episode, I think.
True.
The boomers made something neutral bad to like fucking bad. Yeah. Also, the 70s, you've got this explosion in the biodynamics movement, and you've got a couple of other rising leaders that had like very different perspectives on what biodynamics was. So there's one dude named Joseph Beuys who basically was like, Steiner was anti-capitalist, saying that the three principles for making society sick was wage dependency, private ownership of the means of production, and profit as the driving force. And he advocated for a guaranteed income. Not sure where he found that in Steiner, but that's his point. And like what should be becoming clear at this point is that Steiner's words don't really weigh heavily on the movement like it once did. Like those generations now have taken like iterations and iterations. It's very different from where he felt 80, 100 years ago. And like I said, Steiner was trying to find this way to build bridges between modern science and ancient wisdom. And you can say that he was kind of up his own ass about that. But that was his whole thing, was like, we got to pair these things together. Most of the people in biodynamics today, just speaking to anyone that's into it, are pretty much critical of modernity and science entirely.
Yeah, I've never heard of a biodynamic farm that doesn't want to be like off the grid.
Yeah, and this is just from my extremely limited perspective, but it sounds like grifters just hopped in on the grift.
Grifters can spot a good grift.
Right.
Grifters be grifting.
When one has the foundation there and they just hop in and just do what they need to, it sounds like it ends up like this.
It's like build your own grift. Like, again, to go back to our Instagram homesteaders, it's like, how many of them are like, I'm going to teach you a course on how to sell courses? Like, you're selling the grift. You've figured out that the grift is the thing to sell at this point.
Yes.
And that's what they're doing. And like this issue still continues to exist within the movement, that like spirituality is loosely tied to Steiner's work, which gives it like validity, even though it doesn't really have like a firm framework. So like practitioners can just do whatever they want. And as long as they tie it into some like various spirituality and do the biodynamic preparations, they're basically like, yeah, this is it. And this allows for like very loose fitting science and spirituality that has kept biodynamics on the fringe. But from our perspective, I guess the question is like, what does the science actually say about these practices?
I mean, there's any science involved in these practices?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't sound like they're doing this in like a lab with lab coats. If you're not wearing a lab coat, you can't call it science.
For sure. That is the definition.
Fortunately, in 2013, a lab coat showed up by the name Linda Chalker Scott. And what she did was basically went through every single study that's ever been done on biodynamics and basically found some shit out. Like I said, one of the big things to remember is that organic certification is not significantly different than organics. It's basically the same exact thing except for the 500 through 508 preparations. Like, you have to do those to be biodynamic. Otherwise, it's the same shit. And then, like, if you follow the moon, yada, yada, yada. Across the studies, there's rarely ever improvements from biodynamic treatments compared to organics. In terms of, like, microbial activities, there was no increases in biodynamics. There was zero increases in crop yields. And in many cases, organics actually outperformed biodynamics, which means, like, the preparations were actually making things worse.
You're telling me stirring my energy into the preparation didn't help the crop yield?
It actually made it worse, Matt. I don't know what the fuck your energy is
I've
on, but
been
it's not good.
stirring with so much energy for so long.
Were you drinking Zima and sweating into it?
Yeah.
He doesn't know what Zima is. What year is it?
No, he doesn't. I'm sorry. Sorry, everyone. I felt my back crack as I said that joke. So, in one study, like mango quality was actually shown to be much higher in organics than biodynamics, and another with like vineyard performance. So, like I think that is the area you see biodynamics the most, is like a biodynamic vineyard, right, for grapevines and like wines and shit, right? Like, I feel like that's the only place I ever see biodynamic labels. And one very extensive study on the performance under biodynamics, there were no improvements in grape or grapevine health or quality. And they actually found that the sommeliers that tasted the wine preferred the organic wine over the biodynamic wine, which is like a really expensive fuck up, because wine is an expensive product to screw up.
Yeah, but with wine, people also just like saying shit. You know what I mean?
So Matt doesn't believe that study. I know where that I see the horn on the wall. Now I know where it came from.
Matt doesn't
Matt.
believe in the study, or Matt doesn't believe in sommeliers.
Both.
Mhm. You heard it here.
ASAB. All sommeliers are bastards.
It
Yeah.
sounds made up. I know a lush when I see one.
So, like, the point here is that, like, many biodynamic ideas are like these, like, really gross extrapolations from common sense or spiritual ideas. And honestly, I'd be really curious, given Steiner's, like, willingness to engage with modern science, what he would say based on, like, conventional research, if, like, he would change a lot of his positions. Steiner was just like a weird dude in general. Like, he had a lot of strange positions on stuff.
Yeah, we've been talking about it for an hour.
I know, and I feel like we haven't even talked about a lot of it. Like, Hugel mounds came from Steiner. Like, everyone talks about is this ancient technique. No, it was fucking Steiner who didn't know what the fuck he was doing, which is why Hugel mounds are a shit show for 99% of people. So he also, like, to actually get to the stuff I wanted to talk about, he advocated that germ theory wasn't true because germs didn't make sense versus, like, just cosmic forces.
Well, that's just true.
I mean, yes, that is true. He also believed that, like, the lungs, Mercury, the element, and Mercury, the planet, were intrinsically tied together as part of, like, a anthroposophic medicine thing.
I'm not sure what's so hard to understand about that. They're all the same red.
Yeah, it's totally accurate. Mercury is a heavy planet. Mercury is a heavy element. Lungs are also Mercury.
Same color as the planet Mercury.
True.
Elliot's tied it together. He's actually Steiner
It's
reincarnated.
all based on color theory.
I'm Steiner.
And I'm colorblind.
Elliot removes the mask.
Are you colorblind?
Plot twist. I get my greens and purples and...
Oh my god, the Italian flag must be awful for you.
No, it's just the greens, and not the greens, the blues and the purples and, like, some gray I get mixed up.
Right, the blue and purple of the Italian flag.
Fuck you, Matt.
Matt, welcome to the show.
So, like, yeah, Steiner is just, like, an interesting dude that I think was, like, he really had this, like, radical self-interest position on stuff and was really focused on, like, hyper-individualism, self-preservation, and, like, using space and, like, big feelings to describe his relationship to the world. This is really important to think about as we, like, see this growth of, like, pseudoscience and, like, homestead culture. Like, where does it come from? Why is there this weird Christian love of farming and toiling energy in the homesteader movement? How do all these things start to tie together, right? Why is biodynamics so often fused with, like, very specific traits in people? And I think that's why this is important to start to understand, like, how biodynamics kind of fell into line with, like, and we didn't really talk about it here, but like permaculture and how they influenced one another as they like were growing in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, I think it's important to see how all this stuff kind of ties together. And like now we're starting to get to modern times where we can see how things that have happened in the last 30, 40 years are influenced by this longer history that we've been like kind of weaving together.
Yeah, like I said before, it sounds made up. It sounds like grifters got in on the grift. And it sounds like anytime you try to convince people that they're not just specks of dust on bigger specks of dust flying through the universe, like Horton Hears a Who.
Horton Hears a what?
Have you seen that movie?
Horton Hears a what?
Horton Hears a Who.
A what?
Answer the question.
It was a Hank Hill joke. Come on, man. Get it together.
Answer the question.
Have I seen Horton Hears a Who?
Yes.
Actually, I don't know if I have.
Okay, watch that movie. Watch
Okay.
it.
Okay, my homework.
I know you're not going to watch it. I'm going to make you watch it.
Okay. You're going to have to travel back up from Georgia, make me watch it. Do it. Bring it. So yeah, that's basically all I wanted to cover for biodynamics.
Is that it? We're at the end?
Yeah, we're at the end. I know, it was a riveting
Listen,
hour.
Steiner had some crazy ideas. The people that followed him obviously saw that it was crazy ideas and added their own crazy ideas to their own. And it sounds like biodynamics became sort of a shit show that makes terrible wine and destroys yield on mangoes.
It's key lessons here. Look at this guy just summarizing in an hour and 10 seconds.
Yeah, you're not bloviated at all.
No. So next week we're going to talk about the organics movement. And obviously we've pointed to the fact that there's a ton of overlaps between this, but there is its own strain of crazy that exists in the organics movement. So that's going to be lots of fun. And then we can get into homesteading, back to the land, and white supremacy, fascists, all that shit. It's going to be great. Can't wait. Can't wait.
Yeah, I'll bring my bow tie or whatever. Nice hat, hood.
I got a hood.
Don't tell me that. I'll put you on the list.
Oh, good. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. If you are excited to listen to Organics or you want to read this where we have more information, because obviously we had to cut this a little bit short. If you didn't notice, I feel like we skimmed some stuff. We have an article up on our Substack. You can go to agroecologies.org, go read that, subscribe, all that cool stuff. If you want next week's episode, it is up on Patreon, hopefully, if we got it up in time. If you want to support the show, that's also the place to do it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we will be back in a couple of weeks, or a week, because I'm an idiot and I don't know how calendars work. So 1 week, not a couple of weeks. We will be back. Organics or bust.
Bioorganics.
Bioorganics.
Dynamic diorganics.
Oh, biogorniculture.
Biorg.
Cyborg. Oh my God. You want to know what was on TV last night? Because I only have like the free TV, like Tubu or whatever the fuck it's called.
Tubi?
Yeah, that one. Suburban Commando.
Oh yeah, with the Hulk. Yeah, that's a good movie. It's actually a good movie.
Right? It's a great movie. He's a terrible actor.
Yeah.
Great movie.
I've only seen the whole movie maybe twice. And
he inspired The Rock, which is like frightening.
Yeah, I mean,
The Rock looked at that and was like, I can do that.
Yeah, when they break from TV into the movies, it's always a good thing. It doesn't always have to be on like soap opera or sitcom or something. Sometimes wrestlers can do it too.
Not all wrestlers. #. Yeah, so Dom, please tell me you cut us out by now.